Hey everyone, thank you for joining today. My name is Andrew and I'm product specialist here at ProdPad. And with me today is Gabrielle Bufrem, trainer at Mind the Product and product manager of product managers. Is that right? Manager of product managers at Pivotal Tracker.
A pivotal. Yeah, yeah. It's a lot of managers in that title, I have to
It's a
say.
lot of managers, but all in all, she's awesome and she's here with us today. We've got quite a few people joining. I do apologize again. We're starting a tiny little bit late. The tech failed us, as it does sometimes, but we got it covered. So today, Gabrielle's going to be talking to us about the yin and yang of product management and having a product development workflow that works. So off to you, Gabrielle.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Andrea. I really appreciate it. I'm just gonna like super briefly introduce myself. So I am a trainer for Mind the Product, which I absolutely love. I also manage product managers at Pivotal. And I gave a talk a while back called Transform Me, but Please Don't Change Anything at the Mind the Product conference. And a lot of kind of like what resonated with people a ton was this whole idea of like how much do you explore versus how much do you actually execute, and what is the product manager's responsibility there. And that's kind of how I came with the topic for this, because it is truly a yin and yang, but I do have a lot of opinions of kind of like how to make that split and how to make it work. So my idea for this is I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the concepts and the slides, and then I would love for this to be as interactive as possible and for y'all to have a chance to ask me questions and kind of describe the challenges you're going through, and so that we can see what we can do, how we can make this work. Does that sound good, Andrea?
That sounds like a plan. And we already have some people that send in questions beforehand. So I think people are super excited to talk about this.
I'm super excited too. This is awesome. Okay, let's get started. We talk about exploration versus execution. And I don't think that you can talk about exploration versus execution without starting the conversation by talking about building for outcomes instead of building for outputs. So I do find it important anytime like giving a talk or talking to people, even like in a meeting. I find this like the most important thing to actually define the terminology that we're using. So I will define what outcomes mean to me. And I did take this definition from Josh Seidon's Outcomes Over Outputs, which is like a great book, and you all should read it. It's in the little resource at the bottom. So an outcome is a change in human behavior that drives business results. And I think it's really important to focus on the human behavior piece, because a lot of people say things like, oh yeah, build X on blockchain, human behavior. I'm like, how? Like, what type of human behavior is that, right? So a human behavior is really something that people are trying to do, or an outcome that you want to enable them to do with the output that you build with. So very, very important nuance there. And the reason why I think it's indispensable to have an outcome-driven focus is that the conversation then stops being about deliverables and when are we going to get X feature, and starts being about how are we going to enable our customers to achieve their goals in line to fit in with like our business strategy. So I'm happy to talk through the concepts a little bit more, but I do feel like making this shift, and the shift is not transforming outputs into outcomes. They should be true human behaviors that tie to your business, because if they don't tie to the business, then you're having more of like a product hobby instead of a real product that is driving ideally a lot of business success. After outcomes over outputs, so let's say like you're ready to find your outcomes, then comes the most important thing for me, which I firmly believe that you as a product manager and your team as a product team should very much decouple exploration from execution. And here I have a little bit of a template, if you will, or just a way that I use in order to make that decoupling. And that includes, so on the exploration side, I'm thinking about like what persona I am solving for. Then I'm thinking about the hypothesis that I have of what this persona wants. So back to kind of what we just talked about, the outcomes, here is a hypothesis. We're not ready for an outcome yet because we have not yet defined if what we think is right is actually right. And that is why we're running experiments, right? We're running one experiment, we're running two experiments. Sometimes I run 3 or 5 experiments. And it doesn't mean that I am terrible at my job. It just means that this is hard and that I want to make sure that we are having a lot of confidence that the outcome, the user outcome, is really what the user wants, and that we're solving it the right way before actually moving on to the execution phase. And you see that the outcome only comes towards the end. And then when it comes to execution, I find it very important to describe the problem that you're trying to solve and the outcome that you want to achieve. And what I found in my career is that engineers really resonate with the problem that you're trying to solve. So if you describe to them and you tell them how hard it is, and here's where kind of like the storytelling really comes through in the PM, it is much easier to get them on board. And when you tell them what you like discovered and show the evidence of all the research that you all ideally did together, then it becomes much easier to get the team very, very bought in to what you're actually building. And then comes kind of KPIs or OKRs or whatever methodology you're using to measure. And a big distinction here is that you should not use the same thing to measure exploration and execution. And I feel like a lot of teams that I've worked with in the past are like, oh my God, our experiment failed, we failed. And I'm like, no, your experiment failed, you succeeded because you caught this very quickly. And this is super exciting because now you know that that is wrong. And it took you, I don't know, 2 days when it could have taken you months in development to build this, right? So much more inexpensive than actually going and building out this whole kind of big feature set. While when you go into execution land, like, yes, then you should mostly know what you're trying to do. I will say that I have shipped many features that did not achieve exactly what I wanted them to achieve. And the way I explain this to people are like, wait, how? Like, how did you not do that? And I tell them that user testing and kind of like doing the experiments is, if anyone's familiar with like learning how to swim, it's basically like learning how to swim in a heated pool indoors when everything is really nice and great. And then like it works when you're there, right? You're like, oh my God, this is great. Like it's warm and cozy and delicious. And like I have my instructor right there and I can leave the pool whenever I want. And then kind of shipping your product is basically learning how to swim in the depth of the ocean with like sharks and animals everywhere. And it's super cold and windy and there are tides and all sorts of currents that are taking you away. So very, very different scenario. So a big part of decoupling exploration and execution is understanding as well that after you execute, you still need to go and check in to make sure that the outcome that you set out in the beginning was achieved, because shipping the feature is just not good enough. You need more. You need to be able to validate if what you set out to do was actually done. Awesome. Does anyone have any questions on this stuff so far, or should I continue going and then we can get all the questions? What do you think, Andrea?
I'm going to give people maybe a minute or two to kind of perhaps not be shy.
Yeah.
But I did
I promise.
I did want to just add that it's really interesting that you're highlighting that success metric is not the same as KPI, and it's okay for something to fail.
Oh, it's actually great for something.
Exactly, because if it's, I almost feel like if it's right the first time, did you really experiment enough?
Yeah, that's a great point. I would say you didn't, right? And that's kind of, I think, the beauty of experiments is that you start to get so good at them that you can run maybe 1 or 2 or even 3 a day. So the barrier becomes very low for running experiments. So you feel like it's okay to go with the crazy idea, and that it might fail, absolutely, but it will fail fast and you will have the understanding and the answer and be able to move forward with something that you know is like tried and tested.
We just got a really good question, which is, can you give an example of a success metric that isn't a KPI?
Oh, absolutely. So I think that the biggest thing is So KPIs are key predictive indicators, right? And they're there, and they're basically telling you if you succeeded or you failed. And I feel like the biggest difference between a success metric and a KPI is about the mindset. Like if you don't achieve your KPIs and you have shipped the feature, like you've already incurred a lot of costs by building it, and your team had to devote a lot of resources, and you had design involved, and you had everyone involved. A success metric is similar to the KPI in the way that you set it ahead of time, right? I've seen a lot of teams do this, by the way, where they run experiments without setting any sort of what success looks like. And then they're like, oh, I guess this was successful. And I'm like, well, how do you know, right? Because you didn't say if you needed 50% or 60%. So I would say it is still like a pretty numerical number, but the biggest difference is that if you fail at the success metric level, in the experiment level, that is actually a huge win. If you fail after shipping the feature, that is less of a win.
I hope that answered your question. We do have another one, very similar, which is, as an example, would net new customer conversion be different as a success metric or as a KPI? Likewise for total account size growth. That I'm a little bit confused, but I think the question is, would the total account size growth be a KPI or a success metric? I think that would be a KPI.
Yes, I would say that is a KPI. So without like having context on more, but I would say, so like, think about success metrics as a way to understand if your experiment worked or did not work. And the experiment is not about like, oh, I put this button there. I think that is like one very
I like that you said that just now.
Yes. It's like a very interesting thing about experiments, and like people, they are like, oh yeah, if people click on the button, then we're good. I'm like, wait, what was the hypothesis that you set? Is it that people want to buy more if they are able to buy from this page? Is it that they feel better, right? Like, so I feel like you should have hypothesis-driven experiments and not like experiment-driven, like experience-driven experiments. And that for me is super important. So the success metric should be something that tells you if your hypothesis is right or wrong.
And then the KPI would be measuring,
Measuring if your feature achieved the outcome that you set out to achieve.
Exactly. We've got one more, which is, what do you see as being the main difference between a hypothesis and a problem to be solved? Does your hypothesis become your problem after the experiments have been run?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the core difference for me is a hypothesis is more like a bet, right? It's your team saying like, oh, we know the customer has this problem. We have a hypothesis, or actually there are like two levels to it. So first you can have a hypothesis that the customer has a problem, and then you can do some exploratory research to validate that. Or you can have a hypothesis that a certain set of solutions or a certain experience will solve the problem that the customer has. So I actually feel like there's like two sorts of validation. And I don't know if we chatted about this, Andrea, but I'm writing a book now on prioritization. And
we did.
one of the core things that I'm differentiating in the book is confidence that you know what the problem is and confidence that you know how to solve it. And those two things, I feel like a lot of times are kind of muddled together, and it's really tricky because you might know that the problem is right, but you might not know the answer. So I feel like defining what you know and what you know you don't know is a very, very important part of the process.
I also like that you said the I bet. And that's one way that we frame things sometimes here is I bet that if we did this, then perhaps this might happen. That's just a hypothesis for a problem that your customers might be experiencing. But the hypothesis is just, I don't know if I'm right, but I'm about to find out with a success metric. And if I'm wrong, then I can try another experiment.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And also, I think one thing to note about experiments is I see a lot of like, so either people like try them once and then it doesn't work and they're like, well, this is terrible. Like, I'm never going to do it again. And I'm like, well, have you tried to like ride a bike once? You probably were not very good at it, right? Or snowboarding for the first time, like very painful experience. But the more you do it, the better you get at it. So either I see people that do one experiment, it doesn't work, and they're like, this is clearly not for me, and they never do it again. Or people that are so bought into the idea that they are on like experience number 20 and they've all failed. And they're like, no, it probably is the experiment. I need to continue down this path and like find a way to make it work, which then defeats completely the reason for experimentation.
We've got one more question before we move forward, which is, what do you think are the key components of an experiment and how it differs between B2C and B2B companies?
Yeah, so I think like two parts to the question. So the first one is, what are the key components of an experiment?
Yeah.
I would say you need a hypothesis to test, and that can be that the customer has a problem, X or Y, or it can be that X experience will solve the problem, right? If the problem is known. Then I feel like you need to have the experiment that you're going to run. And there's actually this great new book that came out recently. I just went to a talk with one of the authors, and it's testing business ideas. And it has, I think, like 50 different experiments that you can run. So I think of experiments as like tools in your toolbox, and you need to figure out which one to use at each opportune time. So basically recapping, we have like the hypothesis, then we have the experiment, and you need a success metric. And I would say like even before all of that, you need to know what your persona is and like who you're solving for. Otherwise, you won't be able to actually recruit the right users to run the experiment with. And then the other layer of the question was B2B versus B2C. And I hear this a lot, and I've worked in both a B2B context and B2C. And people tell me all the time, even my reports, right? They tell me all the time, like, oh, it's impossible to run experiments when you're B2B. And I'm like, I do it, right? Like it's definitely possible. It is harder sometimes to get users that are willing to talk to you, or your company might have quite a few of like limitations with it. But I would say that I've seen a lot of B2B experiments to be very successful. It just takes a lot more effort sometimes to recruit the right people. I would say if you have like absolutely no access to users, you should please like vouch for that as much as you can, because it will be much easier for you to make good decisions for your product. And if that fails, then go the layer of finding users that are kind of like lookalikes of the people that use your product and experiment with them. It won't give you as great of sample, and the data will probably not be as correct. So I would course correct for that. But I would say it's much better to run experiments than to not run them.
Cool, thank you. I was going to say let's move forward, but two really great questions just came in.
Yeah,
the first one is just really quick. The first one is really quick. If you could actually tell us the book that you mentioned earlier.
Oh yes, it's Testing Business Ideas.
By?
And then there's a book I referred to on a previous slide that is Outcomes Over Outputs. Super short read. You can read it like, I don't know, in half an hour, you're good to go. And it really kind of makes that differentiation. You can give it to your manager to read it if they're not on board. So like, that's a great little like beginning of the year gift for people.
Cool. The other one, actually, two of the same question came through, but I think it's worth answering, which is it possible? Oh, sorry. Someone just asked the authors for the books, please.
Oh, yes. So the first book, Outcomes Over Outputs, is Joshua Seiden. He wrote for Sense and Respond. And the second one is David Lang, if I'm not mistaken, and Alexander Osterwalder. The second book is really pretty. It has like all sorts of graphics and cool stuff. So yeah.
Cool. Back to the other one, which is Do you think that experiments can be run using prototypes and sort of lighter wireframes and not without requiring IT or engineering resources? And I am tempted to jump the gun a little bit, not jump the gun, but give
Do
my
it.
side of the answer, which is
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely,
Yeah.
please do. That's part of lean experimentation.
Yeah, yeah. I
And
would say most of the experiments that I run involve no engineering time at all. No prototype, no like real code written, no like resources. I will say like engineers have amazing ideas. Like I joke that some of my best ideas as a PM came from the engineers on my team. And I would say that it is awesome if you can involve them in the experimentation process. They will probably come up with ways that they don't need to write code in order to test stuff because they're highly incentivized for you to not need them for that, right? And they're also great partners to think about like, is this even feasible, right? So if you're running experiments on something that is not feasible, it's really hard for them to be effective afterwards because they can be like awesome results and like I've been there, right? Like I learned a lot and like I've definitely done the thing where like me and a designer sit in a room and we come up with all sorts of interesting experiments and then we run them and then engineering is like, yeah, this is impossible to build. And then we're like, oh, okay, maybe we should have known that beforehand. So like, let's have you in the room with us. And they're great partners to brainstorm. They're great partners to think through. And if they start with like an idea or something, like, believe me, like I've seen people go home and code stuff away and come back and be like, oh my God, I got so excited about this. And like, I really wanted to try this thing out. Or yeah, I'd say like involve your engineering counterpart in this kind of like experiment development process. But I'd say 99% of experiments that I've ever run were there was like no line of code written, or the code was so simple that I wrote it myself.
yes, I mean, same at ProdPad. A lot of the experiments that I run myself are actually done through intercom, and it's
Yeah,
just a ping here, a ping there, and it doesn't require, any additional resource, and it's something that the customer team can run and then use that those success metrics to help the hypothesis in case we ever wanted to make a case for whatever it is that we're testing to
yeah.
be native within the application.
Yeah, I'll give an example of something that people were like, what? Like, how do you guys do that without any code and stuff? And we basically used the Wizard of Oz experiment, which is one of my favorites because the name is really cool, right? Like, you're like, oh, I'm doing a Wizard of Oz here. And basically, the whole idea of this is like, you're showing a facade to people and your users that they feel like is real, but behind the curtains, you're doing all the work manually. So we were helping the startup in Paris, and they had this interesting idea for a technology that would actually be able to track how many people come in to the store and like where they're congregating and like what they like better. And they wanted to help that predict demand and interest for the brands. So they were like, how can we test this idea? And we actually helped them out, and we set up random like webcams all over the store, and everyone in the team had the role of counting the people. And we did that for an hour, and then we did that for another hour later. And we were like, wow, this is actually interesting because we do see a correlation between like where people are standing the most with sales, and maybe there is something there. And it was only like webcams spread all over the store and people standing on their computers doing the math themselves.
Cool. We've got another really interesting one. It's all about experimentation. I love it. Do you think that you run the risk of loading your experiments with a steered solution if you involve your engineers up front? Because engineers tend to be solution providers.
Yeah, engineers are solutions providers, definitely. And like that's why we love them, right? They're like so great at coming up with these ideas. It's great. I would say that it is your role as a product manager to steer engineers away from that in the beginning of the process, and to tell them like, we're here to understand the problem, or we're here to set hypothesis. And it's hard in the beginning, but they're really smart and they will get it like very quickly. So I do feel like engineers get framed in this way as like, oh, they are like too solution driven to be involved here. I actually feel like they bring a really good balance to the team that is not there if they're not present. And I would say that the risk of testing something that you can't build is so high that it is okay to sometimes be a little solutiony at the expense of making sure that you can actually build what you set out to build.
Great, thank you. I want to say last question before we move on, but you guys are asking such great questions. Please keep them coming.
Yeah.
The next one is, what level do you think the hypothesis should be at? So do you think it would be an epic, feature, solution, story?
Yeah. I would say it's definitely at the epic level for me. The story level is like way too low, right? So if we go back to this slide here, oh, let me go back. Yeah. So if you go back here, the hypothesis is trying to test if the outcomes that you want to achieve are actually correct, right? So you go from hypothesis to different experiments, and then you eventually arrive at the outcome that the end user wants. And from that outcome, then you're going to break up into stories and into kind of product requirements. But I would say it's mostly at the epic level. Sometimes it will be a very small epic, and that's okay too. And most of the time, it will be something that's more kind of like an umbrella, and it encompasses a lot of different features for you to actually be able to achieve the outcome that you set out to achieve.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. If you're trying to run an experiment at the user story level, you've gone too far. You should definitely, you know, before you get to user stories, then you run that that experiment on the epic level, essentially.
Yes.
Cool. I think we can move forward
Awesome.
with the rest of your slides.
Okay, yes. And if people still have questions about this in experimentation, like we can talk more about it once I'm done with the slides in the end, which is good. Cool. So the other one that is really near and dear to my heart, and I almost
and mine.
feel like yes, I almost feel like this is the ProdPad interface, basically. But it is to ditch timelines. And I was telling Andrea earlier that I'm giving a keynote tonight, and I actually checked in with like all management, and I was like, hey, is it okay for me to talk about this very intensively? Because I have a lot of opinions on it. And they were like, yes, please do. So I feel like it's starting to resonate with people, but in the beginning, I feel like people are very, very keen on having like a timeline and having exactly when this thing is going to be ready. And I find that that is mostly true for companies that focus highly on deliverables, and that the deliverables are like things, and they're not really thinking about the outcomes that they can achieve for their users and the impact. I tell a story here normally when I'm talking to people and trying to convince them to go away from this model is one question that you should totally steal from me and start using with your stakeholders, the hippos of your life, is you should ask them if anyone has ever given them an accurate prediction of when something was going to be ready. And normally the answer is no. And when it's yes, I'm like, oh, did they like make some buffer time up? And normally then the answer is yes. Or did they actually have a lot of their team quit after they turned the thing in? And normally the answer is yes there too. So I'm like, great, so you probably don't want these outcomes. You don't want people like lying to you and inserting buffers there. And you also don't want your team to quit, because it's really hard to kind of like regain those people. And it's a shame to have engineers or PMs or designers or everyone quit over a project. And it's much more frequent than people think. So I tell them, like, I am your friend, and like, I really value our relationship, and I want you to trust me. So how can I lie to you now? Because I just don't know the answer, right? I don't want to start this relationship by lying to you and by telling you that I know something that I don't know. And I tell them, like, what I can promise you is I will give the best predictions once I know more. So when you're thinking about like now and next, and you're at the outcome level and maybe even the story level, like you can have an idea of how much velocity your team is at and kind of when things are going to get ready-ish. And you can start coordinating with product marketing and other parts of the organization, sales, right? And make sure that you are actually thinking through all this stuff and releasing it at a time that is the most impactful for your customers. But when you're at the hypothesis level in the later and the way later column, like, how can you even know? You're not even sure what you're going to build, right? I read this description the other day that it would be the same as telling people like, you've never like crossed this desert before and you're like, oh, it will take me exactly this amount of time to cross the desert. Like, you have no idea, right? We are still under a lot of uncertainty on the now and next. And I am sure to communicate that very explicitly. And in the later and way later, it's like not even a question. It's just very, very, very uncertain. Andrea, I would love to hear your thoughts on this one. So,
I have so many thoughts.
yes,
So
please.
many thoughts. But I like that you use that reference to crossing a desert, because the way I like to explain things is, imagine that you're going on a road trip with someone and all you tell them is, we're going from point A to point B.
Yeah,
That is a timeline. You're just giving dates
yeah,
without really presenting everything else that is part of the context of that road trip.
yeah,
So if you don't get to point B in the time that you've said, people are going to be really upset because they have other things to do than to wait for you, to get to point B. But if you
yeah.
say, you know what, so this is what's happening. These are the problems that we're trying to solve.
Mm-hmm.
These are all the things that, are part of this higher context. Then people are more receptive or more accepting of the fact that, there is flexibility to be had within these things.
Yeah,
So clearly, if someone told me, hey, let's go to France, might take a week, do you have the time? I'll be like, yeah, okay. So it'll be an adventure. We might not even get there, but at least
yeah,
I know what I'm signing up for. But if you
yeah.
just tell me, cool, we're going to make it to, Paris in 3 hours, I'll be like, cool. I don't know
You're
how
like,
you're going to make that
how?
happen, but exactly how. Like, it's impossible. And everybody
Yeah,
knows it, but it's like this false security blanket that people
yes.
like to have.
Yeah, I really like what you said about the false security blanket, because I feel like then you like start burning these relationships by using this security blanket, and it's so sad to see because it's really, really about kind of trust and developing those connections. And when you're like straight up lying to someone or you're telling them what they want to hear now, it is so expensive later to fix it, right? So I really like that. And I also really loved your road trip analogy. And I will try to build on it further by saying that it's almost like you're going on a road trip and you're good having a plan for the day. Like, you know when you're going to eat and you know where you're going to sleep that day. And maybe you will figure that out that day. But like, if you're in day one of the road trip, you are not going to be 100% sure where you're going to be on day 6 or day 10.
Absolutely.
So I think that's kind of like the beauty of like the now, next, later. It's like the now you have a lot of information because it's happening currently. And yes, maybe we will hit a ton of traffic, right? I live in California, so like road trips normally involve a lot of traffic and candy on the way. But yeah, you hit a ton of traffic and then you need to replan. That's okay as long as you kind of set those expectations.
Exactly. And it is about setting those expectations. So if you've got your candy, then everyone's happy. Everyone knows what to expect. But
Yeah,
if all you're saying is point A to point B, I
yeah,
mean, we all know you're not getting from, I was going to say Mulholland Drive to,
yeah,
Fan City in
exactly.
in 10 minutes, because it's not going to happen even when there's no traffic. I've tried it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like that is where kind of like a very good communication strategy is really important. And I joke that like a core part, and I do believe that a core part of the PM role is to be a communicator, both with your team and outside your team, because you're the one person that's doing this, right? Your engineering team is not doing this. Your design team is not doing this. So you are the one that's really sharing out to the world where you're at. And I feel like being radically candid about where you're at is super important so that you don't burn those bridges in the future.
Absolutely. And somebody just said that they absolutely love this slide. And I would agree.
Awesome. Take pictures, like screenshot, send it to people, put it up in your in your workspace area. I've had people do that and they were like, oh my God, my manager came through and then I had the conversation and it worked. So that's awesome. So yes, please like leverage this as much as you can, because I know it is a battle, right? Like we're talking about kind of like what will happen in the future and like how to get there. But I know it's hard when you're in the trenches kind of trying to sell this idea. Cool. And then the other one is, and I feel like it's really important, is prioritize for impact. And this is something that I'm writing about now, impact prioritization. And it's all about like making sure that you're really doing the most important things. Because if you think about it, your time is very limited, right? Like you as a participant and as a product manager on your team, like you have very little time. And if you don't have very little time, you're probably doing something wrong, because PMs are super busy, right? I would say most of your time you should focus on exploration, and a little bit of your time you do need to focus on execution, but it is much easier when you have a very clear focus. And I feel like what led me to be able to have this focus is to consider a variety of variables when I'm making prioritization decisions. And those are reach, like how many people are we actually reaching with this, customer impact, like how much impact are we making on our users or on our customers, because they might be different. Business impact, like will this actually make us more money or more X that we set in our OKRs. This one I really love. It's like the cost of not doing things. And I found that in a lot of meetings, like before you get to cost of not doing, like every idea is a great idea, right? And then you talk about like, oh, what would happen? Like, do we actually need to do this? Like, what would happen if we didn't do it? And then mostly people are like, it would be fine. So we're like, is it really that important, right? And then we talk about confidence, and like that's confidence in the hypothesis, right? It's like, are you really confident that that's the right thing to do and that you know how to solve it? And then you should always consider effort. And I would like super vouch here for you to consider effort, not only on the engineering side. Like I think we got really good at estimating complexity on the engineering side, but we are not yet that great at least expressing the complexity on the product and the design side. So I would say like you're building this feature as a balanced team, as a team of design, product, and engineering at least. So you should consider everyone's time and everyone's effort in actually making it happen. And then this is like my little like funny slide where it's like find a shade of gray that works for you. And this can be Waterfall Agile. It can be like non-Kubernetes, Kubernetes. It can be like lean, not lean, right? Because I do feel like every single business is different, and that it's your role as a PM to identify where you're at in the scale and where you want to go in terms of how much time are you being able to devote to exploration versus execution, how much time are you actually spending in the backlog versus talking to customers, and you are the one that's actually able to move that lever. But don't try to go all the way, right? Like if you're not talking to any customers, don't try to just like stop everything that you're doing. This is like an ask for you to make like gradual changes and to actually track your progress in this line. Yeah, these are my slides. I'm gonna go back to the one that everyone was excited about. And then we can answer some more questions.
It is definitely a great slide. Cool, does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask? Do not be shy. There was one that popped up around, let me find it. How would you make a roadmap for an organization who's never had one before? And have about 60 plus products. I did refer them to something that a resource that we offer called a roadmap clinic, because yes. I think, and you're familiar with roadmap clinics, Jana, our CEO, is one of the people that gives them. It is a very loaded, complicated question.
Yes.
And involves multiple product lines, portfolio roadmaps, introduction of being outcome and objective focused. And I think that's sort of a bit of a gradual change. But our CEO, Jenna Basto, has helped several organizations, particularly large ones like enterprise level, transform into being a little bit more outcome focused. So definitely be sure to check that out. We have a question that popped up, which is, The shade of gray slide, is this saying that Agile is not inherently better than Waterfall? Hmm.
Um, Definitely not, but I'll come back to that.
I think it depends. That's a
Yes.
very loaded question.
Yeah, it is a very loaded question for sure. I will say first to Andrea's point about the other question, like how do you start a roadmap and stuff, like I'll say like Jenna is one of my favorite people ever. She's an incredible product person. Like if you can do a roadmap clinic with her, like go do it. You know, I'm very biased because she's also like a really dear friend, but I'll say like she's amazing at breaking these things down and actually being able to help you get to a phase where you actually do have a roadmap and you do have your roadmap as your communication strategy. And I think Jenna talked about the roadmap as like a prototype for your product, right? Like as
Yeah.
a prototype for like what's coming up next, which is super exciting. So I would say definitely take advantage of that. One thing that you can start doing now, and the way I like to explain things in the product space is a lot like I'm really into cooking. I love to cook, and you normally can't make a really complex dish before putting together like a mise en place, which is just like a French fancy word for like things put in place, right? So basically like getting the ingredients, preparing the
Prep
ingredients.
work.
Prep work, exactly.
Prep work, yeah.
So there's this quote that my parents used to tell me all the time growing up, that success only comes after, wait, how do I say this in English in a way that makes sense? In Portuguese, it's really clear. Success only comes after work in the dictionary. And it's still true in English. So I would say like, it's really important for you to actually focus on what are the aspects that you need in order to get to that roadmap clinic, right? Like what are the things that you can do now and prepare? So I'd say reading those books, figuring out how to be more outcome oriented, like starting to do that work is really, really important so that you can actually get there and be more prepared. That being said, you will never be fully prepared. So expect to have to do a lot of work before getting to this. The talk that I was referring to earlier is named as Transform Me, but please don't change anything. It's on the Mind the Product website since I gave it last year. And it's all about like organizations that want all the results, but are not willing to put in the work. So I would say putting in the work in order to get to this roadmap phase is awesome. Getting the buy-in is like you're halfway there. And then from then on, it's just really a lot of hard work and framing things. Now onto the loaded Agile versus Waterfall question. I will say that I have never worked for a Waterfall organization personally. That being said, it is completely by choice, and I have picked the companies that I worked at based on what they preach and what they practice. I will say that I have seen a mix of Waterfall and Agile work extremely well before from kind of stories that I heard. And the whole idea is like, the shade of gray slide is like, if you are a Waterfall company, right? If you are totally here in this dark spot and you want to become Agile, like it's telling you that it's probably going to take a few iterations until you get there. And that your version of Agile might not be Google's version of Agile, and might not be Netflix's version of Agile, or Spotify's version of Squad and Agile. And that is totally okay, right? There is no playbook that tells you exactly where you need to be. And I would say that you should be inspired by these companies and excited by what they're doing, but you should not try to copy every single thing that they do, because what works in one industry doesn't work in another. It's more complex than that. And the typical product management answer is, it depends.
It depends. I was going to say that. And sort of to flow from that, there's no reason why you wouldn't be able to have an outcome-based roadmap if you are on hardware or if you're Waterfall, because you still need to define a strategy.
Yes, so, and I have good friends that are in hardware, and they do run a lot of experiments. They follow like a lot of agile and lean practices, but they are under certain timelines and deadlines, right? It doesn't mean that you can't experiment and that you can't try and that you can't be acting on short feedback loops. I also feel like agile became a very loaded term. if you read the Agile Manifesto, like it doesn't say a lot of the things that people say today. Like you don't need a Scrum Master to be Agile. Like it's not saying that in the manifesto. So I do encourage you to think about Agile as like principles that you want to follow. And the principles are really boiling down, at least for me, into responding fast to change and user feedback and being able to iterate and add that to your product. So as long as you're doing that, on a day-to-day-ish basis, I think you're being more agile.
Absolutely. We have another great question, which is an interesting one, is do you attach any timeframes to now, next, and later? So do you do like quarters or shorter than that, longer than that? Does it even matter?
Yeah, I don't. And I don't recommend doing it because then you lose the beauty of now, next, and later. You're saying now, next, and later because you don't want to have a time frame. Yeah. I would encourage you to ask leadership, like let's say if they are imposing a time frame on you, I would encourage you to try to understand why, right? And sometimes there's this huge event, sometimes there's like a big launch, and then you might have to tweak some things, and that is okay. But I'm 100% sure that everything on your roadmap doesn't have a reason why it needs to be launched on that day, right? So I'd say like identify the things that do have time constraints, and sometimes they do. Sometimes it's a huge security fix for a customer, and like I get why they want it immediately, right? And sometimes it's worth trumping everything else and prioritizing that at the expense of other things. But I'd say most of the time, if you ask why, you will have an interesting conversation with your stakeholders, and you will realize together that it actually doesn't need to be on that date, that it would be nice if it was, but it's not business critical.
Absolutely. I would also add, if you really want to kind of frame this a little bit better, think of the now as things you have committed resources to. So these are the things that your team are definitely working on. Next might be things that you're perhaps running some initial discovery on. Could be something really, really simple, you know, just asking some questions around things like that. It's not necessarily anything that's a priority. Perhaps your design team, like ours, our design team is about 6 months ahead of development. So they're starting to run some initial prototypes, initial experiments type things, very lo-fi, nothing that takes up too much time. And then, you know, later is for later. I mean, you haven't even looked at that stuff, but you know that it's within the realm of things you want to look at. And that way, if anyone is asking questions, you can say, look, the now, literally things that we're working on now, but it's ongoing. I mean, how long that takes it almost doesn't matter. It's about the quality of the stuff that you're putting out, not how fast it's coming out.
Yeah, I love that framing, Andrea, and I think I will steal it and use it.
It's almost like I don't talk about this every day. Which actually this leads into a question, the next question, and something that some misinterpreted terminology, I think, that happens, which is, you know, Kanban approach versus this now, next, later. They are visually similar.
Yes.
But a lot of people seem to not understand why. And to be fair, there are columns, so I understand why people have a hard time with this. But, you know, one moves from left to right and the other one moves from right to left.
Yeah. I will say, like, I have seen teams be extremely successful with Kanban when they're a small, co-located team. And Kanban for me is super helpful once you know what you need to do, right? There's actually a great like Silicon Valley episode. If you haven't watched Silicon Valley, I like highly recommend you watch it. It's hilarious, and you'll identify with so many of the things and be like, oh my God, they need a product manager so badly. So it makes you feel great about your job too. But it's basically like when you know what you need to do, and it's like almost like a to-do list, a prioritized to-do list, which is the same as like your user stories, right? They're prioritized in the backlog. You know what you're going to do next. I've seen it be really successful then, and it's clear because you know what you're going to do, you know what you're doing right now, and you know what is done. And that is 100% in the execution column for me. In terms of a roadmap and the now, next, later, the now are things that you know. The next are things that are a little fuzzy and you are doing research on. And the later, to Andrea's point, like are things that are like, they're maybe important, but they're so kind of far off, but you don't want to lose them. So you kind of keep them in that column. Hope that answers the question. Kanban for me is really about like executing and having a system to execute well. And the roadmap and the now, next, later is all about facilitating your exploration and also communicating that to your stakeholders.
Absolutely. What I would add to that is keep in mind that Kanban outlines tasks over time, so to speak, because you have all these workflows that you're going through, whereas the roadmap takes a step back from the workflows, and looks at, the higher level, as you said.
Yeah, I think that
So
makes a ton of sense.
if anyone ever uses the term Kanban roadmap, they are in fact incorrect.
Oh yeah, I've never heard that. That is not good.
I have, and
Oh no.
it triggered me, but I'm not going to let it trigger me today. We have a really great question around the columns, which is stakeholders sometimes expect solutions and ideas for the near-term roadmap, so the now and the next. How do you show the solution side of things on the roadmap? The way we do it at ProdPad, I don't know how you guys do it, but you do have the ability of show the ideas that are within those initiatives or within those cards. And those ideas will inevitably have those statuses that link to that workflow, or to those workflows. So you can create different versions. I mean, you can create a really high level version that just shows, outcome, and all your cards, or you can always expand that a little bit and show all those different ideas that are involved.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say like that is similar to how I do it. And one thing that I write normally for the next, I really love, so Amazon has this whole idea that you actually need to be a very clear writer to become a good product manager there. Like they make people read long-ish memos before meetings, and people really need to read them, right? And I've taken that approach and I started writing feature narratives. And the whole idea of a feature narrative is for you to describe the problem, describe the outcome, and then list out all the experiments and all the possible solutions that you're having, and have all of that in a like concentrated place so that your stakeholders can go see it. One other thing that I would say is I normally invite stakeholders to be observers in experiments that my team is running, because that gives them a lot more understanding into your process, right? If you're thinking about like running user interviews and like talking about the value of talking to users, it's very easy for me to understand why, because I'm like, yeah, I do that all the time, but they don't. So having them as allies, even in a closer way than the roadmap in this process, is super helpful. And I'd say one like easy way to do it is to include snippets of experiments and interviews into your kind of like presentations that you do weekly, or into your status updates, so that they can consume that content in a very easy to digest way, in the way that they like consuming it.
Absolutely. Guys, I'm really sorry. We only have about 3 minutes left. I know that Gabrielle has a talk to prepare for later today. I want to pick one question, but they're all so good. I really, I don't know which one to pick. So I think I'm just going to go with the first one that's in front of me, which is, this might be a bit complicated. We could talk about this for another hour. So ditching timelines and focusing on this version of being outcome driven and now, next, later, can be a really big cultural shift for organizations that are used to having timelines and Gantt charts. Do you have any suggestions around how to encourage this shift?
Yes, I do. I would think about framing that conversation and thinking about, like, if you ask a stakeholder, right, or those people that are resistant, oh, we are now output driven, or right, we're delivery driven. Do we know what success looks like for this? Do we know how much impact we've made in the past X amount of time with the things that we've delivered? And I feel like framing the conversation around impact and actual success will make you both quickly go to the realization that like success means shipping. And normally in delivery focused organizations or output focused organization, you getting the feature out there is like success, right? And then introducing the concept of like, what if we actually could know that what we set out to do was actually achieved? And then starting to kind of like reframe that mindset. And I would say, like, I talk about this in the talk that I'm going to give tonight, but I'd say like start small, right? Like if you are a huge organization, like start with one problem, start with one item on your roadmap. Don't expect people to just kind of like change overnight. Like people really hate change, and it's for some reason like really like sexy and cool to say like I'm adaptive and I like change, but people don't like it, right? They like routine and they like doing things the way they're doing it. But I feel like framing things as like, hey, this is something we're trying out, or like this is like a very low barrier entry, like we're just going to do like one of our features this way, and then we can assess progress and see what happens. I feel like both having like the value conversation and starting small and treating it as an experiment is super important for that conversation and for that change to actually happen. And one more tip is there's a great analogy of like the shit umbrella, and it's like that one person that is protecting your team from all that organizational bureaucracy and all that other stuff that happens, especially in big companies. I'd say like find a sponsor that shares your opinions. They might not be like the VP or a senior VP, but having kind of like a cheerleader on your side that believes in the same stuff you believe in really, really helps the process.
Cool. Thank you so much, Gabrielle. Thanks everyone for attending today. Good luck on your talk later tonight. Best of luck. We will be sending this recording out over the next few days. So if you guys want to share it with anyone in your team, if you need to change some mindsets internally, I think this is the perfect webinar for it. So take advantage of it when you guys get it. Again, Gabrielle, thank you so much. And I will probably see you very, very soon.
Yes, yeah. Well, I'm excited. Somewhere in the world, it'd be great. I'd also would love, like, if you still have questions, especially the people that asked those last questions, just send them to me on Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm happy to try to answer something out and maybe even write a little bit about it so that more people can get those answers too. So
yes, I do believe that is your Twitter handle at the bottom right.
It
correct?
Is, yes.
Cool.
Yes.
So any questions, please send them over that way, or you can also ask me through at ProdPad. I do look at the account, so I can answer personally as well.
Yeah, Andrea is like amazing at this stuff. So like, please take advantage of her. You have her, so like, just take advantage and like ask all these questions, because yeah, she just has like so many like nuggets of insight that I take a lot of the time. And like,
oh, you're making me blush.
Aw, no, you're just great.
Well, thank you guys. Enjoy the rest of what's left of January, I guess. And have a good one. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.